Next up on the broadcast, Representative Steve Clouse of Ozark is back in studio with us. Steve, welcome back to Capitol Journal.
Thanks, Don. Appreciate
nice to
it.
see you. Of course, you serve as chair of the House General Fund Budget Committee, always a major task. We ended the legislative session earlier this year with projections that the general fund was really going to be a challenge next year. Do you see that challenging easing at all? Are revenue numbers looking any better?
Yes, I do see it easing, and it's been a pleasant surprise. The economy has held up good. Insurance premium tax has been good. Interest on deposits, which and that's part of that reason is because in the last couple of years we've been trying to carry funds over to be in anticipation of some costs that we know we have coming, like the CHIP program, and so usually we don't have any money carried over in the general fund. So we've had some sitting there that's been drawing interest. So that's good from that standpoint. But I think the main thing is the simplified seller's use tax, or online sales tax, that the U.S. Supreme Court finally gave the go-ahead to states and localities to be able to collect that has really helped us. And so I think we're going to be in pretty good shape next year.
That's good to hear, because when we wrapped up the legislative session earlier this year, there were kind of doom and gloom projections where the general fund was concerned, but you didn't know a lot then, right, about where we might end up with revenue.
That's right. And the online sales taxes numbers have been good, and of course, 3 years ago we were getting $0 from that, and now it's has been steadily growing, but it's going to plateau here, so we've got to be cautionary about that at some point here in the next year or two, most of the companies that are coming online, they'll all be online, and at some point it'll level off. But in the meantime, we've been able to bring those funds in and be able to craft a budget.
That leads me to my next question, and that was going to be, do you see the online sales tax budget line as a growth revenue stream for the general fund, which is something that is desperately needed for a number of years, but I hear you saying you do expect a plateau at some point?
Yes, I don't see it necessarily being so much as a growth fund as something that we've been missing, that we should have been getting from brick and mortar stores. And so back 10 years ago, when everything really crashed back in '08, and we were having such problems in both the education and general fund budget, that was a big concern, not only for us but all the other 49 states and all cities and counties all over the country, and particularly here in Alabama, where this issue was really starting to boil up, and Congress would not address it. It was a hot button issue where they would not address it, and they kept deferring to the courts, and finally the U.S. Supreme Court took up a case, which was Wayfair versus South Dakota, and we had been patterning our law basically after South Dakota, hoping that the Supreme Court would hear that case. They did. They ruled favorably, and so we've been able to take advantage of that. And we were one of only about 15 states that had set the stage there to be able to do this in anticipation of a Supreme Court ruling. So we were a little bit ahead of the game than most of the other states who are now starting to come online, but we were ready to go immediately.
The diversified seller's use tax has really evolved in the last couple of years too, since we started enjoying revenues from it. I'm talking about things like revenue streams that come from apps. You use your app to order food or to order groceries or things like that. That all falls under this.
That falls under this now, and we set that up in not this past session, but in the 18 session, to be able to access those sales taxes on what we call the platforms. They go on to things like Amazon and eBay, and that didn't start being collected until January of this year. So really, this past budget year, we only collected 9 months of those platform sales. So we'll be collecting the full 12 months this year.
The two biggest expenses, obviously, that you have in general fund are Medicaid and prisons. Let's talk about Medicaid for just a moment. Governor Ivey recently announced an extra, I think, $78 million to help with Medicaid reimbursements for hospitals. Will that go a long way in helping with expenses there?
Well, it will. Of course, it was $22 million from the state standpoint, and that we had put that in the budget last year as a conditional in case we had those funds, and of course we did. And so she released it the first week in October. which was really will help our Medicaid healthcare providers, particularly rural hospitals. I don't know how long this would last. It was just a one-year deal from Congress, whether or not they'll reauthorize that, but it helps increase the amount of reimbursement that providers get, particularly rural hospitals, when they serve Medicaid patients. So it'll be a total of that $22 million will draw down another $56 million in Fed funds.
Medicaid, did it not, also had in this current budget, I think, some carryover money from the year before, which was a big help.
It was, but we were still carrying over from that BP monetization that we put in the end of the 16 session going into the 17 session. So we've been carrying over those funds, but they're pretty much gone now. So we'll get back to our regular increase that we usually have with Medicaid. I anticipate them having probably about a $45 million increase from what we funded with them with last year.
And to all of those who look to Medicaid every year, especially Democrats, and say let's look at expanding Medicaid once again, do you see that as even a remote possibility?
Not next year, I don't. I think we're back in the same situation we were 4 years ago in 2016 when we went into the presidential race in 2016. It's sort of deja vu all over again, wondering what's going to happen on the national scene.
Right.
And we'll be hearing a lot about that from the different presidential candidates about health care policy. And we thought then, after the 2016 race, that we were going to have some new formulas put forward in 2017, particularly with block grants. And all legislatures around the country went into their sessions wondering what was going to happen. And of course, in final analysis, nothing did in Washington. So I think we're just sort of on a standstill again, wondering what's going to happen in Washington. That determines what the state policies are going to be, basically to determine how much money we have to match on the state share.
You mentioned at the outset the challenge that we had this year in funding the CHIP program, the Children's Health Insurance Program. Will that be a challenge again in the next budgets?
Well, the points that we put across, not only this year, last year, but the last 2 years, is that we knew those formulas were going to change. We were not even sure if the program was going to be reauthorized. And of course, that was one of the things when the federal government shut down the first time for about 5 days. That was the impetus to open it back up, when everybody came together saying we've got to reauthorize the CHIP. And of course, in doing so, it was a 10-year reauthorization, which was good because that gives us some certainty. We've been operating on year to year. But along with that 10-year reauthorization, they basically have thrown some of the cost back to the states now, when in reality we really haven't been paying anything into it in the past 20 years when it first started. So this year will basically be along the same FMAP that Medicaid is. So we said last year that we got to be ready to come up with about $70 million more for the CHIP, and that's about what it's going to be. But we're prepared. I want to commend all of the legislature. Last year was my 25th year in the legislature. It was the first time we ever passed a general fund budget unanimously.
Wow.
And the Senate, they had a few little different ideas, but after we went into conference committee and came back out with the budget, then they voted unanimously. So all 140 members of the legislature knew that we had this increase coming in CHIP and to be prepared for it, and we are.
Hope we can be unanimous again next year.
That's right. I hope so too.
Let's talk about prisons for a moment. That's going to be the big elephant in the room in the coming session.
So.
Prison reform, and of course the prison budget comes out of the general fund budget. So there are a lot of unknowns, I guess, contingencies you have to plan around where prison reform is concerned.
That's right. On Medicaid and mental health and those type things, we have a lot of federal funds that we have to do certain things to get a match. We don't get any matches on the prisons. It's all on the state as far as the prison budget is concerned. But one thing we do have to be leery of is the federal court, that we may be under federal court order if we don't meet certain standards as far as medical care, mental health care, overcrowding, those type things. And so, those issues are being formulated right now. I really can't give any answers as far as any building projects at this point. I think maybe in the next few weeks we'll start to get some type of information from the administration on that. But it's going to be a daunting task. We have increased the prison budgets here a good bit over the last 2 years to help them hire more people to try to ease that workload and the prison staff shortage that we got. And we've made some progress, but really not enough. It's not an easy task hiring prison guards.
Governor Ivey has obviously been moving in the direction of a private lease deal to possibly build new prisons. How do you feel about the private lease deal versus the way we've gone over the last several years? That's where the matter went through the legislature,
right,
and they couldn't agree.
Right. Came close though. They passed it in the Senate, and we came pretty close in the House. And you know, after 2 years, you know, I don't know, we may need to have another crack at the apple, but we'll have to just see what the proposals are and see where the numbers are.
House General Fund Budget Chairman, Representative Steve Clouse of Ozark. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Don.
Thanks for your leadership.
Thank you.
You bet. And Capital Journal. We'll be right back.